Good afternoon, everyone. So, we safely returned from our morning trip, and we also gathered all other members of our participants of our conference. So, welcome again. Our next session has the topic maturity and parenthood, and it is my pleasure to invite our two dear friends and colleagues, Pavol Bargár and Kateřina Kočandele-Bauer, to share their ideas with us. Our first lecture will be offered by Pavol Bargár. Pavol studied Protestant theology in Bratislava and Prague, and also Jewish-Christian relations in Cambridge. And Pavol also was the head of the Society for Jewish and Christians. He worked in a Central European Center for Missionary Studies, and now he is a researcher at the Protestant Theological Faculty of Charles University. Pavol published a book called Narrative, Myth, Transformation, Reflecting Theologically on Contemporary Culture. And today he has a lecture entitled Maturity and Fruitfulness in the 21st Century Religious Culture. So please, Pavol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Petr, for a very kind introduction. Dear friends and colleagues, it's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this chance and also for challenging me to do research and write on a topic that I normally probably wouldn't choose for myself, maturity and fruitfulness. As you see, the main title of my talk today, this is the title that I received, Maturity and Fruitfulness in 21st Century Religious Culture. I added the subtitle myself to narrow it down a bit. I'll focus on A Song of Ice and Fire, which is an epic fantasy book series by George R.R. Martin, which is the work based on which Game of Thrones, the HBO TV series, was produced. With Christendom having been disintegrated, it can presently be difficult to speak of religious culture as such without any modifier, not least in relation to Christianity. However, there undoubtedly exist subcultures and communities that continue fostering what could be referred to as religious culture. Moreover, there are various resources, including those coming from popular culture, that enable pursuing such endeavors. Due to its resonance with religious themes, the epic fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin represents one such resource. Here you think that so far 5 books are out, 2 more books are announced and expected. Well, some people believe they will never come out, that the writer got kind of stuck, but we'll see. And as I said, there is an HBO TV series, which I'm not going to consider here for this presentation. I'll focus on the books. While the main focus of this article is the issue of maturity and fruitfulness as represented in contemporary religious culture, it is first well worthy to explore how religion is thematized in the series. This paper seeks to theologically reflect on contemporary popular culture and aims at exploring themes and issues that can provide people with a sense of orientation and meaning in the world. A Song of Ice and Fire is important in this pursuit because it fosters a sense that there is no immutable fate, but that transformation is possible and that one can bring about change, especially if in cooperation with other people. Such a view nurtures one's growing into maturity and becoming able to fruitfully contribute to the upbuilding of one's community. I would argue that A Song of Ice and Fire introduces religion as something implicit, non-established and privatized perhaps, yet meaning-making and orientation-giving, that has a potential to appeal to a certain, and especially in the West, admittedly increasing group of people today in a shift that can be conveniently referred to as from religion to spirituality, or perhaps from organized, established religion to decentralized spirituality. From a theological perspective, spirituality accounts for a fundamental dimension of religion, effectively representing its core. With respect to the theme of this article, this presentation, it is important to note that in popular culture, spirituality is often identified with wholeness, integrity, authenticity, freedom, creativity, and a connectedness with the real. Reflective of theological conversations on the quest for authenticity and transformation in a framework of emerging 21st century religious culture, one can usefully consider the following words by Norichika Hori. I quote, "Spirituality refers to both belief in what cannot usually be perceived, but it can be felt internally, and practices to feel it with the whole mind and body, accompanied more or less by attitudes of individualism or privatism, anti-authoritarianism, and selective assimilation of religious cultural resources," end quote. If one takes this shift from religion to spirituality as constitutive for 21st century religious culture, one might rediscover Dietrich Bonhoeffer's deliberations on religionless Christianity as fruitful for our present discussion on maturity and fruitfulness. For Bonhoeffer, the church can only be authentically and meaningfully present in a modern world, come of age through prayer and work, meaning work of justice. Bonhoeffer understands Christian life as participation in the act of Christ event. That is the locus of redemption, which is to be found in God, withdrawing God's self from the world to make space for human action. Based on this assertion, I would propose that for Bonhoeffer, Christian, and I think we could say human maturity, presupposes an autonomous world, the world of God's withdrawal and Christ's weakness that allows for human participation in the event of redemption and genuine fruitfulness. As far as the content and focus of this shift from religion to spirituality is concerned, it involves addressing issues such as truth, meaning, goodness, evil, practice, suffering, redemption, or beauty, as they surface in specific contexts, be it in religious tradition or popular culture. Striving for maturity and fruitfulness, one should always consider these notions to be a certain lens through which one can think critically about values, beliefs, practices, and experiences that one encounters vis-a-vis one's understanding of the absolute. Necessarily, then, this meaning and culture-making process is normative, as it seeks to understand the absolute reference point of existence. It is contextual, as it is always embodied in a certain locus, certain place, situation, context. And it is dynamic, as it is part of an ongoing multivocal conversation. In conclusion, we could say that mature spirituality that has a potential to construct and shape 21st century religious culture and make a fruitful contribution to society at large must, to cite the observation of Gordon Lynch, adequately address the following challenges. I quote, it is taking seriously the insights of religious tradition, making constructive contributions to debates in a pluralist society, and acting in solidarity with those who suffer. In my paper, I would like to argue that from a Christian theological perspective, the pursuit of maturity and fruitfulness in human life entails being in community, since human nature is inherently relational. To grow in maturity and to bear fruit in one's life, the whole web of one's relationships at various levels must be transformed. Christian maturity then is understood in terms of love as striving for non-linear striving for perfection. Ultimately, this process must be enabled and carried by grace as a stir of new energy, hope, and possibility. This thesis will be in my chapter, the whole chapter which I'm not presenting now. It will be elaborated in 3 steps that make for 3 interrelated dimensions of this process, namely grace, love, and community. And it will be done in dialogue and reflecting on a song of ice and fire. But for this presentation, I'm only focusing on one of those 3 dimensions, on community. One of the fundamental characteristics of the postmodern condition is a turn to relationships, by and large in response to the previously dominant Enlightenment philosophy of the freedom of the individual. In contrast, it is now asserted that the pursuit of happiness, if we will, that can be only experienced through relationships with others. The recent accent on community can therefore be understood in terms of the human quest for wholeness and integrity. According to contemporary sociologists, all functioning communities feature a set of common characteristics, such as a shared frame of reference to interpret and construct the reality, a sense of group identity and belonging, and a person focus that outweighs the group focus. In A Song of Ice and Fire, it is first and foremost the tragic character of Theon Greyjoy, who shows what the outcome might be if one is uprooted from one's community. The youngest child of Lord Balon Greyjoy, ruler of the Iron Islands, Theon was sent to serve as a ward to Lord Eddard Stark after his father's rebellion against King Robert Baratheon had been suppressed. While raised as a member of House Stark at their castle called Winterfell, and having become like a brother to the Stark children, Theon still feels alienated from the community. This becomes fully apparent in A Clash of Kings, the second book of the series, when, authorized with a task, Theon acts treacherously toward his best friend and now King Robb Stark. His betrayal is motivated by Theon's attempt to win his father's approval and recognition, however, remaining ultimately in vain. Balon Greyjoy, that is his father, only has contempt and disregard for his son, leaving Theon alienated also from the family of his birth. Rejected by his biological community, that is Greyjoy, and unable to affirm the acceptance by his adoptive family, that is Stark, Theon is thus left hanging in vacuum, displaced and disoriented. His deplorable state is reflected through his actions when and after he takes over by force his former home, Winterfell, the residence of the Stark family. Eventually, he begins to feel remorse for his brutal and treacherous deeds, including the presumed killing of the youngest Stark boys, Bran and Rickon. Although some of his remorse seems to be authentic, he is captivated in a vicious circle of finding excuses, blaming others, and asking himself and others if he even had any other option. The character of Theon Greyjoy proves, as one can observe, that low self-esteem, personal immaturity, and estrangement from one's community is a volatile combination that can easily become oppressive and destructive both for oneself and others. All in all, Theon shows indication of regress rather than growth. With respect to the role of community for one's growth toward maturity and fruitfulness, King Robb Stark represents Theon Greyjoy's opposite. Raised by loving parents, enjoying the privilege of growing up with a number of siblings, his sisters Sansa and Arya, and brothers Bran and Rickon, and step-siblings, Jon Snow, and in a sense also Theon Greyjoy. And being part of a web of relationships at Winterfell from his birth on, Robb is deeply and organically integrated in his community. Community can, therefore, have a decisive significance for forming one's individual views and actions, to account for the synergy of the individual and the communal in the process of moral decision-making. Elizabeth Butzar introduces the notion of dichotomy. To my mind, Robb Stark fittingly exemplifies a dichotomous existence, as his deliberations and deeds consider both his own integrity and the well-being of the community. In A Storm of Sword, the third book of the series, the young king gets married to Jane Westerling of a lesser aristocratic family after having slept with her during a period of his convalescence after a battle, although he was betrothed to one of the daughters of Lord Walder Frey, his powerful ally against House of Lannister, his ultimate enemies. As a result, Robb loses the support of House of Frey to maintain his personal integrity. To win back this support needed to protect his community, Robb is willing to accept a proposal by Walder Frey that is both humiliating and costly for him as king. Furthermore, Robb always administers justice himself, as he was taught by his father, Eddard. Thus, for example, he personally executes his vassal, Lord Rickard Skarstark, condemned for disobedience and treason. Growing toward maturity, Robb Stark pursues honor, justice, and truth that he owes both to members of his community and to his enemies. The reader of A Song of Ice and Fire, for his or her part, comes to realize that if a community is to be functioning, non-oppressive, and flourishing, it needs to be characterized by diversity and the pursuit of honor, truth, and justice. Coming to my conclusion now, and I apologize for all the names. I realize that if you're not familiar with the books, that might be too much, but hopefully it was possible to follow it. So for my conclusion, with the end of Christendom, one cannot likely expect the emergence of a religious culture that would unambiguously appeal to a larger segment of the global population. Having said this, however, it does not mean that religion plays no role in human life anymore. Actually, quite the contrary seems to be the case. Yet the significance of religion for human existence in the 21st century, not least in the West, is increasingly marked by the shift from organized and institutionalized forms of religious life to decentralized and privatized one, or to use the convenient shortcut from religion to spirituality. Religious culture in the 21st century should, therefore, be understood in terms of subculture that appeals to a certain group of people. Very often, A Song of Ice and Fire appeals to nones, so-called nones, that is, the people who do not identify with or who do not identify as affiliated with organized religion. Yet they yearn for the relationships and encounters that have the power to transform their lives, to pursue the values of justice, peace, reconciliation, or community. In sync with the mindset of these spiritual seekers, the book series strives for authenticity and meaning in life, fostering growth and transformation. I would argue that the series' main message is that change for the better is possible, And I'll try to show it in a longer version of the paper, especially in the character of Jaime Lannister. It is the message that one should not give up on the values of good, justice, and truth, even when one is ridiculed, especially the characters of Jon Snow as the illegitimate son, and Tyrion Lannister as a person who is physically deformed and thus ridiculed and looked upon by others. When it is inconvenient, see the example of Robb Stark that we discussed, or when one must live under the circumstances of hardship, see the character of Daenerys Targaryen, a princess who was sent to exile because her father, former king, was executed. In midst of all of this, one is to grow in maturity toward virtues and communal well-being. By immersing themselves in the story, the readers of A Song of Ice and Fire can grow toward this maturity and fruitfulness together with the book characters. They can acquire the imagination, insight, and power to change their own world. Therefore, this book series affirms and cultivates what has a potential to be a religious culture for the 21st century. Instituted and nurtured by grace, love, and a sense of community, religion is to be understood here as a pursuit of relating oneself to certain points of reference, such as truth, meaning, redemption, goodness, or beauty, that give orientation and purpose to human life. In conclusion, growing toward maturity and fruitfulness means growing toward the recognition that human existence is inherently relational. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Pavol, for this wonderful culture image of relationality and maturing, and also for keeping with time. So we have now time for questions. I think Tim was a little bit quicker.
Thank you very much, Pavol. I need a kind of question about this kind of relationship between spirituality and religion. I mean, it seemed to me at the end that you were coming back to saying there is still a role for religion, reinterpreted. Because at the beginning, I mean, spirituality, of course, that you described how culture is, but of course how culture is may not be necessarily a good thing, although obviously you need criteria to decide that. So I mean, what do you see as the relationship between the two? Because if spirituality is really about a kind of privatized approach to things, then obviously whether it can actually allow for community, or whether you need a community in order to have a mature spirituality. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I believe that at one point of my paper I said that I mean, if we reflect on spirituality theologically, that one way of looking at spirituality could be that it is a certain core that kind of nurtures our lives as human, and for some people it can mean really that they stay at the kind of privatized, non-institutionalized level, and for some people, I mean, this could be as an impulse perhaps to reinterpreting their also communal ways of relying to people, and also in religious settings. So I mean, my main point is, I guess, that that religious culture really, that it cannot be some homogeneous, clear-cut unit anymore. That it's really, I don't know, I mean, on a tram on the way here, I was thinking that if a term subculture I use here, if it's really a good one, if it's not more like that there are perhaps a culture that we are living in, kind of like a patchwork of different orientations, different impulses, and people adding to that from different traditions, from different resources in a shared environment of their lives. So perhaps I'll have to think about it and change the term subculture. But I mean, I would say that this is the understanding. So yeah, not so much perhaps drawing the I mean, the opposite between that, that spirituality can have nothing to do with religion anymore. I don't think that's the case. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Pavol, for the lecture, describing quite well the territory in which we move, the shift from religion to spirituality, the example from the religious culture. But I would move to the main question.
Okay.
In these settings, what then does it mean to mature and to bear fruits? And how would you reflect on the shift from religion to spirituality theologically?
I would say that maturity, I mean, really for me, relationality is the key there, as I emphasize on several points. And it's a relationship on several, or relationships on several levels. So maturity is being kind of like in unity with oneself, in integral personality, and then one can reach out to others as well, to build one community. So to and I mean for people who are believers, who are looking for also transcendental perhaps meaning of life. This also means relations to God in Christian tradition, or to transcendence, the real, the term I mentioned there. So maturity is there. This kind of relationships are there, and we are striving for them being functional and being present and valid in our lives. And then through this relationship, we bear fruit by making contribution to the communities and societies we live in.
Thank you. We still have time for a question or two. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And I was just thinking about I wouldn't say necessarily it was your definition of religion, but at the end, when you described it on the image of Game of Thrones books, you came sort of to the conclusion that how the religion is expressed there is, for example, in the developing or maturing sense for good, beauty, the striving for justice, and so on. So it's like a very secular idea of religion. What I'm thinking about, for example, in antiquity, there was quite strong philosophical tradition that would probably define all these virtues also, but it wasn't religious at all. So I like the secular version of this definition of religion, but I'm thinking about whether it's a religion.
What is religion then?
I would say it's also very much in the tradition of secular humanism, which I think they would very much oppose the idea that it's being called as religion.
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, it's more of a sense that there are some overlaps. I mean, there are different, of course, there are different resources, right? Religious people would draw to a major extent on different sources. And I guess also that the ultimate horizon is probably somewhere else, right? That you're being engaged in these things, working for justice, for reconciliation, for peace, because you hope, or I mean, yes, you're nurtured by hope that this is also of importance that go beyond your own personal physical existence, or even existence of your society, of your community. So I guess, yes, there are certain overlaps. You're right.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify what I mean. Yes, exactly what you just described. If there is this personal motivation of those characters, but I'm not sure if those characters you presented would be driven by such religious motivations, and therefore, without the motivations, is still religion?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm not saying that the characters in the books would have necessarily this motivation, and even I mean the author, I don't think that he has this motivation, or I mean this focus in mind there. It's for me, it's more like, I mean, that what the readers of those books can they gain for themselves. I mean, I said that it can give you some imagination, some insights for your own life. And for people who come from secular background, perhaps, I mean, the outcome somehow will be different than for people who come from Christian background, and there are some very dismissive voices on this series from some Christian circles as well. So I mean,
Thank you, David. Matthew, would you like to raise your question shortly?
Probably more of a comment. Thank you very much, Pavol. One thing about one of the main differences between the spirituality and religion was the communitarian aspect of religion, which supports growth, maturity, and so on.
Yeah.
But I think that what was missing for me was the other side, the dangerous aspect of the same thing, of communities, in some ways specifically, especially religious communities, in some ways can be very dangerous. And
I mean that they would be restrictive and oppressive in a sense because those ties are too close there. So for people,
yeah,
living
that's one of the examples, but you can probably come up with many of them. So, maybe sometimes, for example, leaving a community for some people is the necessary step towards maturing and so on.
No, I agree. Yeah, thank you. That's a good point.
Thank you. Pavol wanted to raise a question, but we are really short of time, so please, just briefly.
Yes, thank you. Also, I wanted to ask the similar thing as Maťo said, whether the relationships or the community is enough to define the maturity, because one can be part of the community and not to be mature, or one can live in the many relationships but not to be mature.
Yeah.
So what is the distinction between whether it is enough to define it by the relationship or
well, I mean, in this presentation, I only focused because of time on the dimension of community. In the longer version, I'm also working with love and grace there as well. That I think that and I see them as interrelated dimensions for this process of growing into maturity and then bearing fruit. So fruitfulness. So I hope that those other aspects or dimensions can offer certain checks and balances to what could be that repressive aspect or side of communal life, of community. So, yeah.
Thank you, Pavol. So let's applaud.